So this is part of a class of political, social, economic development in Brazil. In this session, we're going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on the Brazilian and the world economy. Here we have a list of readings suggested to the students as part of the preparation for today's discussion. Yeah, next, Julia, please. Yeah, and some background information here. And we've seen that the markets have stumbled over the past month, and the value is about a third of what they were 30 days ago. We're starting to see bailouts and financial assistance on magnitudes that haven't been done before. $2 trillion in the US, almost $1 trillion in Europe, in the US dollars. I thought that was interesting to add those two numbers here in order to give us an idea of magnitude. So we're talking about almost 15 times what was spent with Marshall Plan in today's money, and we're talking about an order of magnitude bigger than we saw in the last large crisis. So the big question that everybody has in mind from economic and financial perspectives is to what extent this is a crisis that is similar to the one that we saw during the Big Depression in 2019. This is something that we're going to be discussing today as part of the context in which Brazil will be dealing. When we think about the vehicles of transmission of the crisis, we're definitely going to be seeing impact on trade and commodity prices, especially because Brazil is heavily dependent on China as a trade partner, right? And in foreign direct investment. The magnitude of the impact of the actions that the government has announced is close to $200 billion as well, which is unprecedented also in Brazilian history. At this point, it is very hard to infer what's going to happen. I think it is fair to say that it's going to be a tough year. Perhaps we're going to go through another recession after a decade that was where we saw the worst economic reforms in the Brazilian history. So it's we are bracing for very challenging times, and one of the goals for us to discuss here, to what extent some of those challenges also going to be creating opportunities, and if there's room for optimism in spite of all the big problems that we're going to be facing very soon. Next, please. And here are our stars today. And John Welch, Executive Director, Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, former Managing Director and Chief Economist at HSBC. Many generations of CIPA students, alumni know him as a member of the faculty. John has also spoken in our classroom a number of times, so we are very happy to have John back in our virtual classroom. Another star, directly from Rio de Janeiro, talking from the field, is Thomas Trebat, Director in the Columbia Global Center, and one of the most and foremost experts in Wall Street on Brazilian issues, and in not so distant past, Managing Director at Citibank and Chief Economist for Latin America. And last but not least, a cameo participation, Professor Gray Newman, who has been joining us, and I apologize for Gray for the miscommunication, and I really thank him for joining us on short notice. Gray will be giving us a historical perspective, how he sees this crisis in comparison to previous ones. Apart from teaching at CIPA, in the past, Gray was one of the key analysts and shaking markets with his comments on the Brazilian economy as a former managing director Morgan Stanley. So the way that we're going to be discussing this is threefold. John is going to be giving a general overview of the global economy. Then Tom will be addressing more specifically what's going on in Brazil and in which ways the Brazilian government is trying to tackle the problem. And Gray, as I said, will be making some comments, and we'll be addressing COVID-19 more from a historical perspective. Before I turn over to our speakers, and if you could move with the slides, please. I have two announcements to make. The first one on the left-hand side is that there's an event here at IGLAS, also virtual event, that the Global Center is co-sponsoring, where we will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 in Latin America tomorrow. So feel free to sign up online. And something that I just found out, and I thought was good to share, there's a movie that's going to be released at Netflix on the 17th this week. It is about the life of Sergio Vieira de Mello. Maybe for the younger generation, that's not a familiar name, but for those of us who are interested in diplomacy and international affairs, Sergio Vieira de Mello was probably the most important diplomat that Brazil has produced in the last half of a century, and who died tragically in an attack in Iraq. And this movie, based on his story, is going to be available on Netflix. I strongly recommend that you check it, since you guys all have a lot of time to spend on binging in a different series. This one is worth trying. All right, so without further ado, let me hand over to John Welch. And John, thanks again for joining us tonight.
Good afternoon or good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation, Sydney, and what a great panel you have here. A lot of old friends. I'm going to try to share my screen right now. And let me just try to make this into a presentation as opposed to, it's not letting me do it. Yeah, I'm blocked by the thing at the top. So I'll just leave it like this if you can see it okay. Well, I prepared a number of things on Brazil. I'll give the general backdrop, and I'll add to the conversation later when we go to question and answers. But this is a pretty tough one, I have to say. I don't think any of us have ever seen anything quite like this. And we have quite a bit of experience on this panel between Gray and Tom Trevat and Sydney as well. Let me just go to where we were last November. I guess maybe we only perceived about these things early this year, but it was a little late actually. It started in November, or even maybe perhaps even earlier, as they say. And certainly we had a very interesting thing with world interest rates, and this brought about a lot of theories, some that I would say are not quite as credible as others about why we have real low interest rates. But over the last 20 years, or more than 20 years, I go back, and this was one of the things that always allowed me most of the time to see the cup half full for Latin America especially, and that is that the trend for interest rates was down, but the reason for the trend for interest rates going down, and the reason for the trend is demographics. But you can see that rates are going down, and certainly this crisis with the collapse in investment demand that we're having, we're going to get, again, very zero world interest rates for quite some time. But really the trend was there, and my view on central banks, and I was at one for a little while, I was at the Fed, is that central banks can mess stuff up pretty well, but in terms of forcing things downward, these interest rates are low because of demographic reasons, not necessarily for monetary policy reasons. And if you're a central bank, you don't want to fight against that trend. You want to accommodate that decline or recognize the decline. So certainly most of the central banks in the world over the last 30 years have become Wixellian in the way they go about monetary policy. That means that Knut Wicksell was maybe the inventor of central banking along with Bejo. And he said, well, what you need to do is to try to find the neutral rate of interest, the real rate of interest, translate that into a nominal counterpart with your target on inflation, and certainly as the father of inflation targeting, and then flatten the curve through credibility. And don't fight where the real interest rate is supposed to go. And I think we've had, that's by, starts and stops. I think a little bit too much emphasis have been put on central banks and not enough on demographics, because it explains all the stuff we got wrong since the late 1980s. I worked with a very bright young economist. Of course, he's not young anymore, just like the rest of us, but a guy named Kent Hill, and he was working with Ralph Bryant on explaining the U.S. current account deficit through demographics in the late 80s, and he was thought of as a heretic. He was quite attacked within the Federal Reserve System. And it turns out he was just spot on. Carlos Salinas de Gortari was moving into a very aggressive privatization effort at the end of the 1980s because he was worried that we're going to have a massive scarcity of capital. And Kent said, no, we're going to have a glut. And all the conditions for that glut are still here, at least for now. There was a number of things mitigating against that, but we'll see. Demographics really explains it. Why? Because it explains savings and investment patterns across countries. And with the aging of the world population, especially in the G7, that means that the demand for investment is going down. And as the boomers, I'm the tail end of the baby boom, moved into middle life, you were saving more, right? And so you had this huge increase, and emerging markets should be in that high savings area. The Asian ones are, at least for now. China is aging at a record pace because of their population control, but we're getting very fast aging in Latin America as well. Brazil right now is aging as fast as China without having all these sort of government imposed policies, and certainly China tried to reverse theirs years ago. The one place that should be importing capital is Africa. Because they're younger, and unfortunately the reforms, you have to have a combination of two things. You have to have the demographics, and you have to have the financial and economic structure to be able to credibly absorb this capital. We've seen a number of balance of payments crises over the years where countries were importing too much capital given their infrastructure where they were in reforms and couldn't do it. And the tragic exception in all this is Africa, as I'll show you in a moment. Certainly, to my mind, and this was the conclusion of these policies as well, is that current account balances were not the big risk. I mean, there's a beautiful model by Maury Obstfeld, who was a professor when I was at Columbia when I was an undergrad, and Ken Rogoff. It's a wonderful model, but it works really well with emerging markets, but it doesn't work very well for the United States. And it's been predicting a balance of payments crisis in the United States for about 30 years now, as well as another well-known economist, Paul Krugman. And that's not what we had. These dangers come from leverage, and certainly in emerging markets, current account deficits, which mean high capital inflows, can be leveraged too much and create a big problem. But certainly the US had a serious leverage problem in 2008, 2009, and not really a current account deficit problem. And the markets worked quite well. And I'll just go over the sort of basics of this model and then talk a little bit more about this and conclude. Kent was criticizing, well, you're assuming perfect capital markets and life cycle. I use life cycle, other people now use, there's just a million updates to what they were doing. Not using a life cycle, but using permanent income, et cetera, and overlapping generations, different cohorts. But he basically wrote another paper with a world model that ended up translating later into the McKibben-Sachs model that said, well, that even makes my point even stronger, because if we don't have perfect capital markets and countries can't absorb the capital that they otherwise would be in a perfect, then the glut will be even worse. And he was right. And here we are still with this. So with this aging and looking over to the future, young but aging, savings are low but increasing. Investment is high, so typically savings is higher than investment. Local interest rates, if there's no international capital flows, are high. And you have a current account deficit because that's the definition of an excess of investment over savings. If you're middle-aged but aging, you have much higher savings because most of your population is in, and I'm using dependency ratios. I'll show some of those in a moment. Are earning more than they're spending, and there's still high investment because the companies are still investing in increasing productivity of their workforce. So that's where you get this inversion of the savings investment equation. And interest rates are high but declining, and you started to get synchronization worldwide for the last 40 years. If you're old and aging, your savings are lower and declining because you're retired, you're not working anymore. Now that's been changed because a lot of people work much later now than they used to, and certainly life expectancy is much longer. And investment starts to slow down, and then you don't really know where you are because you're getting a decline of savings and investment at the same time. But in all likelihood, you're going to have low and falling real interest rates. And of course, if you have need for structural reforms, you won't be able to bring in the capital. You probably don't have very high savings rates like Brazil, for example. And you don't know where the current account's going to be. Typically, you'll get booms of capital inflows and so forth. But most likely, you have also real interest rates high. This context completely changed, of course, since the COVID-19 breakout. But just to show you current percentage of young in each of the populations, you see that most of the world has aged. The number of young in the population has dropped rather significantly, and that's also true in Latin America. But you can see, really, the only place that has still a high proportion of the young is sub-Saharan Africa. And again, I talked to tragedy. It's really quite tragic that the countries in that region have not been able to do the reforms necessary to take advantage of really an amazingly low interest rate environment. And the aging is also stark, especially in the G7, and that means investment is lower. And the drop in investment with still higher savings rates is what really explains how the rates have come down. But that's going to change because, as I said, there's not very many young people worldwide, and we have a longer life expectancy. We don't really know where this is going to go, but we do know as the world ages that real interest rates continue to drop. And barring, maybe a post-COVID-19 baby boom in the world, I think that trend is going to continue. And certainly the current circumstances have engendered a collapse of investment, and that means rates are going to drop again in real terms. Certainly how this plays out, demographics may change. The pandemic itself may actually change some of the cohorts. The elderly are more susceptible. And certainly if you look at certainly New York State, that they publish every day the updates now, the age demographic of fatalities is heavily skewed towards the elderly. So we may, at the other side of this, I don't think the projections that we're seeing in terms of how this is going to play out and so forth really don't show we're going to have a big change in demographics because of it. But that is, if the original forecast that some people came out with, especially Dr. Ferguson, we might have had something, but he's now corrected those a little bit. Certainly, the geometric progression of this virus is impossible because once everybody's infected, have no more infections, and that's the sort of herd concept with immunity. But the major policy and growth risks, don't come from current account balances. But however, what comes next? We're putting into place massive fiscal expansion, massive monetary expansion that really should be temporary. I think most of the countries that we're going to talk about, and I would include Brazil in this, have fiscal situations that a quick reversal of these expansions can take place rather quickly. But the big risk here is that they don't. And so we have a lot of distortionary policies being put into place, a lot of intervention by governments. And as we get back to normal, I'm not going to predict when that's going to happen. Many of these should be sort of disassemble sort of the way the London Olympics were with all their temporary spots for sports. So let me just talk a little bit about COVID-19. It's somewhat, no one would accuse me of being obsessive compulsive, would we? Anyway, I've been, had to make sure that I understood all the math and things like. I'm not going to bore you with a big long presentation. I'll leave that for another time, or I'm good at boring people, so that's pretty good. Anyway, where we are. This is as of today, as of yesterday. Okay, there's a really good website. It doesn't allow you to download the data, but it allows some transformation. It's Worldometers, and you can see as of this morning, we had active cases of 1.4 million, resolved cases of over 620,000, and it shows you the cases that are active are mostly mild. 4% are serious to severe. And the thing is, at some point, the left-hand side is a shift to the right, but it doesn't seem to be happening. Of the closed cases, we've been holding at 21% mortality rates. Now, those are closed cases, so that doesn't have anything to do with the overall mortality rate. But it's been holding at this ratio for about a week and a half now. It used to be a little bit more skewed toward recovery, but I expect over time that to go back towards recovery. You can also transform the cumulative or the logistic graphs into logarithms, which is a much better way to go. Doesn't seem like it looked like we had a false top of the thing, and then that makes sense because this is spreading to countries that don't have that many infections. So it's something I look at 5 times a day. This is the more important graph. This is the United States. This is the logistic graph in logarithms. And you can see it looks like we're starting to flatten out. And this type of thing is, we've seen a number of different models showing that we're starting to get to the inflection point. And this one clearly shows we're at the inflection point. We're on the other side of the curve, but we're at a very high level of getting new cases every day. So we're still at about 25,000. I haven't been able to update that today, but still and the fact that it's flattening rather quickly means that some of the social distancing policies that have been taking place are working. Here's Brazil as of this morning, or as overnight. Looks like they're at the beginning of this, for sure. If we go to the logistic, the slope is declining. I don't know if we have passed the inflection point and I'll let Tom and the others comment on this, because Brazil is in the late parts of summer and the early parts of fall and flu season, et cetera. That seems to go along with the trajectory of this virus. It hasn't started yet, so we'll see if there's nothing coming back up in July. Doesn't look like this is flattened out yet. It just doesn't, there's no way to predict what this is going to do, but certainly it looks like we're still on the ascendant part of this curve, but I won't speculate on that. I will steal from JP Morgan, and I'm sorry about this. This got all messed up in translation. So yes, I stole these today, and that's why I had to pull the all-nighter to try to get this thing done. But you can see these are projections from the Ministry of Health and WHO that show that Brazil is right around here and still in the ascendant part of this, and looking at a peak somewhere around May the 1st. And you can see the trajectory of other countries leveling off. It is below certainly the sort of standard China curve, and well below. It started off faster than the United States, but below it now, and certainly below Italy. So far, it's sort of going to schedule, but also Brazil is hotter, and apparently that may have some effects on transmission. If it's hot out, the R naught might be a little bit lower, the amount of people one person who has it infects. But I think it's way too early to figure on this. And here is another measure, containment. And certainly, especially in the United States, but also in Brazil, private citizens have done their own containment, and private companies have done their own containment, then you know, the governments have been pretty fast, but they've been behind sort of the private sector for sure. And you can see here, Brazil is sort of on the higher level of containment, which might come to as a surprise to many. But it looks like that, you know, the lockdowns, especially at the local, the municipal and state level, look to have already been implemented quite quickly after the first coronavirus case was diagnosed. And then also we have this other measure of social distancing. Brazil hasn't done quite as well as some other countries, and it sort of has kind of stopped. And I'm not going to make any political statements. I'll let the others talk about that. But on the Brazilian side, things look that they're going to sort of course. But for sure, I did not bring in the World Economic Outlook, which came out yesterday. But certainly, and everybody's guessing, and they admittedly guessed that when you look at, they're looking at a world recession, a drop in GDP of 3.6%. But it could certainly be larger, it could certainly be lower, but you know, the question is how quickly does the economy start going again? And this is the real question at this point, and none of us really know. So I'm going to stop my comments there. I've gone my 15 minutes and come back with other pointed comments when we get to the question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. And we have a couple of minutes for questions and clarifications. And if one of the students who are enrolled in this course would like to make any questions. So while you prepare questions, John, could you clarify on the projections that you mentioned about the world, that the World Economic Forum is expecting the economy to go down by 3.54% this year overall? Can you think in terms of what are the regions that are going to be most affected or impacted?
Sure. That's an extremely hard one as well, Sydney. You know, we looked. My best guide right now is the IMF World Bank reports. I usually don't trust them so much, especially with Latin America. But all of them are indicating that the most of Latin America is going to be affected, one of the most, and certainly Africa is going to get hit very, very hard. And that's more a question of infrastructure, of medical infrastructure, and the ability to social distance. So there's a number of Asian countries, number of African countries, and Latin America where it's hard in the big cities to socially distance. You know, certainly in China, especially in some of the more dense populous areas, it's very difficult to say. But you know, the question is, what kind of policies are going to be efficacious? Well, certainly the fiscal expansion worldwide will help people keep their jobs for a while. Then the real question is it's more up to the timing of the virus. Now, there's many professions that were able to go remote very quickly. My job, I was able to go remote very quickly. The universities have gone remote very quickly. Many of the information services, but there's some that you can't. And the question is when even, you know, companies that continue to work, that are distribution companies like Amazon, et cetera, are having some problems because they still have to social distance and they have to create a work environment where you're not in contact with other people, and that's quite difficult. In some of the manufacturing parts, it's not as hard because you have a lot of robots used, and also usually on assembly lines you do have some spacing, but that's not so true in electronics. So and then the farmers, they're not really inhibited from working, so agri-industry should work out all right, but we've had this massive collapse in international trade and the prices of commodities. So that's where it becomes very sticky for the agricultural sector. They've already been hit by a number of things in a number of countries. Brazil's was helped. Soybean exports to China were helped by the trade war between the United States and China, but that was only in volume. The consequent decline in the price of soybeans kind of wiped out whatever gain. They're kind of neutral, wasn't a big gain for them. And market share in commodities is easy to lose. It doesn't take much to lose that. But let me finish one other thing. I think your question depends upon the policy response, and it's not just the fiscal and monetary sides. It is the trade side as well. And I think we've seen mostly not a great reaction on that front. We've seen some selective reduction in tariff duties and tariffs on imports of medical equipment primarily worldwide, but we have not seen an opening. And it seems to me that that is the best response, especially when you're talking about importing inhalers, and all this is all phasal, right? So some parts of the United States are being hit at different times. Same thing between Brazil, Chile, Peru, Mexico. They're getting hit at a different pace than the G7, and therefore, ventilators are reusable. So if you don't allow for free trade in this equipment, I think it's very deleterious. I think many have thought, oh, this is, and it seems that in Washington they seem to think that they're vindicated some way by their protectionist stance and all this. I would argue otherwise. I think it's urgent, especially for inputs to production, for medical care and pharmaceuticals. It's urgent to open the markets and also provide intellectual property protection, which is all in the sort of middle of the negotiating table. But right now, we have seen, protectionist policies in a number of countries that we never even seen, but they're typical in Latin America, like taxing exports or doing things like that. But I think really, especially for the other side of this, resisting protectionism even more so than before is crucial.
Thanks so much, John. So next, we're going to focus more on Brazil. And so let's hand over the presentation to Thomas Treba directly from Rio de Janeiro. So Julia, if we could upload presentation. So floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't see the presentation yet, but I know it's coming. Thank you very, very much, Sydney. Julia, a pleasure to be here with John and Gray and with all of you as we look at how this crisis is playing out in Brazil. And John has set the table very well for us to stand the broader international context. And I'm sure he will delve into some of the details of Brazil too when we get to the Q&A. But let me focus mainly then on Brazil, go straight to the point. My first point being that obviously there's never a good time for a pandemic to arrive, but this one has caught Brazil at a particularly unfavorable historical juncture, both economically with an economy in recession basically for the last 5 years, and socially with alarm bells sounding in every social indicator that matters, from health and sanitation to unemployment to extreme poverty. All of that was worsening before January and February, for years before January and February. And the data on the spread of infection, as John has expertly shown us, are alarming. The data today, sadly enough, recorded yet another record in a number of deaths and rapid increases in the number of new cases. Mostly it has been up till now concentrated in the two largest urban areas of Rio and Sao Paulo, but now spreading out in the interior of Sao Paulo and elsewhere in the country. And this is of great concern to us in Brazil, as it is, I'm sure, to those of you listening to us in New York and other hard-hit areas. But here in Brazil, you do not have a lot of margin for safety in terms of the health system. The health system, as I want to tell you, is a good system. We'll talk more about that in the rest of my remarks. But it could be easily overwhelmed by numbers like this. If John's suggestion that the worst is yet to come, it won't be here until the end of the month, early May, this could be easily overwhelmed. Not enough beds, not enough ventilators, not enough PPEs, and all these jargon, all these terms that we've all become sadly familiar with. There's not enough in Brazil. So our only hope is containment, as John pointed out to us. And yet that remains a very difficult policy in any country, and perhaps particularly so here in Brazil, where there is, and to say things clearly, a failure of leadership at the presidential level. noted, that failure noted all over the world. And that's a glaring weakness at a time when you really, your only hope, your best policy, lacking equipment and having a vulnerable population in a very large country, is containment and isolation and social distancing. Those techniques work. They're showing signs of at least working reasonably well here in Brazil, and it would be disastrous if the president's insistence on weakening and going back to work prematurely causes another outbreak in the disease. And as we speak, maybe before we hang up on this call tonight, Brazil's much lauded Minister of Health, he's quite the equivalent of Dr. Fauci, but more political in the United States, Luis Henrique Mandetta, name none of us knew probably until a few months ago, who's become really the symbol of resistance in Brazil and resilience and isolation. And he could be out along with this whole team as we speak. It's a complicated story. Maybe we'll get onto it later, but it's concerning when containment is your only real hope. But is this calamitous backdrop, 5 years of recession, fiscal problems for maybe 10 years, is also highlighting for me the strength and resilience of institutions in Brazil. So that's kind of one of a bottom line I want to leave with you, put it out there for debate. We're kind of stripping the veil from the Brazilian economy and from Brazilian society in a sense, and seeing really what is making this place move and how strong are those wheels and pulleys and levers that drive the economy and society on a day-to-day basis. We're seeing them now more clearly. But anyway, let's maybe move through, Julia, if we could. The first couple of that slide there tells you what I'd like to do in the balance of my remarks. Just hold that for a second. Look at the economy on the eve of the crisis. Look at what Brazil's economic response has been, and then maybe peek beyond the crisis, the outlook for the Brazilian economy. The next slide repeats the comments that John has made, so I'll skip right over to the economic dilemma on the next slide. You'll see there in this slide that the 5 years basically, 5 years of very slow growth in Brazil, what we call a lost half decade, where growth has been considerably below trend. Growth in the Brazilian economy, despite hopes to the contrary, was quite meager in 2019, just about 1.1%. In fact, for the entire decade since 2010, growth on average in per capita income has not been much higher than about 1%. So that means you're doubling your income every 70 years, and that's obviously insufficient in a middle income country like Brazil. Investment as well has been quite low. So expectations for 2020 were already low when the virus hit us, and now growth is collapsing in the second quarter, as it is all over the world. This is a sudden stop that none of us, John, were prepared for in graduate school to take into account. We learned about other types of sudden stops, but not sudden stops in production and in commerce and in business and in every other aspect that matters to the modern economy. The forecast for this year, as John tells us, are still evolving. St. Paul was the first out there, ECLAC, the first out there with a forecast of about minus 4.5% for the Brazilian economy this year. Doesn't sound too bad, but it's really a major recession, one of the largest that certainly I ever have witnessed. The World Bank says -5, the IMF -5.3, private forecasters have gone as high as -6. I suspect it'll be even worse than that before all is counted. What matters is maybe not so much that GDP number, but the strength of the recovery. We'll get to that later. But suffice it to say, we're really, the trough hopefully will be now in the second quarter, this period of time through June, and the true numbers when we hear them will be horrifying. Poverty has also been increasing. That's the next slide, Julia, if you would switch to that one. Didn't quite, I went for the visuals here instead of the most up-to-date data, but I think this still shows us a slide from the Vargas Foundation. The backsliding that has occurred in Brazil, the increases since 2014 approximately in poverty and extreme poverty, they've been rising. Millions and millions of more people, by Brazil's definition of poverty, falling below poverty, and a good percentage of those in what Brazil calls extreme poverty. Those numbers, after years of significant declines, that's the blue dotted line that goes down, declines in the poor population have begun to inch up, and the data only covered 2017. But if you look at the latest data through 2019, that adverse trend of increasing poverty and extreme poverty has only increased. Social programs, fortunately in Brazil, are strong. I want to make this point. They've suffered in recent years because of fiscal constraints and frankly, a lack of priority on social programs. The pension system in Brazil, people who are receiving pensions of one sort or another from the government, that amounts to 14% of GDP. That's about twice as much as we spend in the United States on pensioners. So that provides a sort of, unintentionally, a sort of income stabilizer in this day and age. So the Social Security system, the SUS, Sistema Único de Saúde, is a health system in Brazil, which is really a model for the rest of the world. It reaches into all corners of Brazil. There's not a family in Brazil that isn't within reach of a health worker. So we've got a good reach of the health system. It's not a strong system, but it's a broad system and people do have help. There's the iconic program Bolsa Familia, which today reaches 14 million families. It's a symbol too of a certain neglect in Brazil. Social programs. There's something like 1 million families, 1.5 million families on the waiting list to join the program, Bolsa Familia. There are other programs too for the disabled and for the rural poor and so forth. But those kinds of programs are in place, they're working, but they're weakened by years and years of a lack of investment. Lack of investment characterizes Brazil in general, but it has affected these social programs in particular, just when we know how important social programs are to the future of any economy and especially to the future of the Brazilian economy. It's now, we need these social programs more than ever, and we need to extend them and not to curtail them. And that's not a political statement on my point. I think that's going to be a clear conclusion in the policy debate that will follow, and it's just already occurring here in Brazil. Brazil's fiscal space to start out, and that's the next chart, a little bit jargonistic and partially in Portuguese. John referred a little indirectly to this. Brazil doesn't have, by ordinary economic measures, a lot of fiscal space to spend like the US can spend up to 25% of GDP. The numbers are going to be far more modest. Brazil is not in as good a position in terms of debt to GDP. That's the dark blue bars right against the left-hand axis. By the time Brazil came out of the 2008-2009 crisis, its debt to GDP ratio was only about between 50 and 55%. And now, as you see, it's almost 75% of GDP. And it's going to have to go up. This is a major change in the conversation in Brazil. They're going to spend whatever it takes to save the economy, to save lives, to reactivate the economy. So we're looking at debt to GDP ratio to go above 90%. This has to be done. I think it's a fait accompli. But it does mean that serious fiscal reckoning is going to have to occur at some point in the future, or that the country is going to have to significantly reorganize its fiscal finances. We'll talk more about that later as well. Additionally, Brazil is dealing with a large number of shocks. John mentioned them for us. I don't need to go into them. The trade shocks resulting from the US-China war, decline in commodity prices, John mentioned. This next chart, if you look at it, Julia, they switch to the next one, just shows you what John was referring to. That dark red line, this is something I borrowed from the World Bank's report that came out earlier this week, shows the capital outflows in all the large emerging markets of the world. And that dark red line, compared to previous global crisis, this crisis stands alone in the terms of the flight of capital from all the emerging markets. And Brazil is a case in point. It's one of the largest sources or hosts of foreign capital, and you can see what direction foreign capital has been taking for a while, and now in an accelerated fashion with the crisis upon us. Okay, so enough of sort of the background and why this hit us at a bad time. The next slide I'd like to look at is Brazil's response. And after a slow start, I mean, this took the Brazilian government with a sort of what is known as somewhat pejoratively here in Brazil as a neoliberal orientation, preference for the market versus the state in economic activity, took this government and caught it very flat-footed. So it took a little while for Brazil to change gears, but they are changing gears. That's a message I want to transmit to you tonight. They've thrown aside the fiscal goals for this year and probably for next year as well, loosened up on many regulations, moved lots of money around, and they're starting to respond. They've come up with a war budget to separate COVID expenses out of the regular budget. That is something that was approved virtually unanimously by the Brazilian Congress, which, by the way, is a very proactive player here in Brazil in urging greater expenditures. The priority in the war budget is for the health system, as I've said, but there are also policies, I'll talk about them briefly in the time that I have. There are also policies to provide income support, especially maybe reaching the most vulnerable, including informal sector workers who aren't registered in any government registry of deserving recipients, but they need to be registered very quickly. There's liquidity support. Didn't talk about that very much, but these are huge amounts of money being released and made available both directly to finance and to business to keep operating so that when we do recover, and God willing, that won't be too much in the future, there'll be firms that can reopen. They won't have all gone to bankruptcy. And then there's a fiscal response in Brazil, measures to shore up the economy. Let me look in the balance of my remarks at some of these policies on the main income support policies, not all of which are yet approved. And only this week that some of the money start to flow. I've mentioned Social Security already as being a very important social safety net. That the Social Security expenditures have been increased slightly, not much, maybe they'll increase more, but that is one aspect of government's actions. There's a 13th salary, for example, being provided for Social Security recipients. The Bolsa Familia program, the iconic program I referred to earlier, has received some extra funding. The major policy that's new and different is something called Auxílio Emergencial, emergency assistance, for all workers who qualify. This is sort of what the economists call helicopter money, just money that drops into your account because the government thinks you deserve it and need it. Brazil has an enormous advantage here in that it has good statistics on who the poor are. That includes Bolsa Familia recipients who work in the informal sector, so they're kind of, the government knows them, and other conditional cash transfer programs also have fairly up-to-date records of the poor. Brazil has kind of led the world in these kinds of programs, and they know who the poor are, as I said, where they live, what their bank account is, and they can reach most of them pretty quickly. The program involves a fairly modest cash payment, 600 reais a month for 3 months. That's about $125, so not much, but it's the difference between life or death, maybe for the most vulnerable people. Women, heads of households will get something like $250 a month. The new feature of this program is to add in informal workers who aren't in anybody's lists and who would run the risk of falling between the cracks. They don't really work and are not formally registered to work and not formally recorded as being employed. So this could be a very large number of Brazilians who are presumably right now without any support whatsoever, unless they've got some savings to fall back up on, which presumably they don't. This could be a large number of those who fell between the cracks, so to speak. There's many 18 million people in Brazil applied for this Auxílio Emergencial just on the first day that the enrollments were open. So it's going to take some weeks, I think, before significant help arrives to these people. But ultimately, just looking at Bolsa Familia and the special emergency aid programs, you have the potential at least to put some money in bank accounts for up to 55 million Brazilians, 1/4 of the population of Brazil. So that's important. There is money set aside for 3 months in the government budget, but I don't have the slightest doubt that they'll find money for more months should that be needed. So that's an important example of income and employment support problems. There's another that I wanted to mention, maybe get some comments on it, and that is working with the government, working with the private sector to prevent dismissals, prevent firings from occurring. There's legislation being discussed, not yet approved, that the workers would accept 70% reductions in their salaries and their workloads for the next 3 months only, as long as companies don't fire them. They would accept that reduction and they'd be compensated partially by increases in unemployment insurance. And the companies themselves would be able to benefit from certain government liquidity programs if they adhere to the stricture not to fire their workers. It's being contested in the courts. It's going to take a few days or maybe weeks for that program to roll out, but it looks to me like an important program, and it's an innovative type of program which could have an important effect. Briefly about liquidity policies, not to get too much into the weeds on what the central bank can do, but the central bank is another example of a very strong and quasi-independent institution here in Brazil with a long-standing reputation as a very good and well-managed central bank in terms of inflation targeting in particular, also exchange rate management and other issues, and also overseeing the banking sector. The central bank, in line with what other central banks have done, the Fed, the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank and so forth, have done similar measures, but this is quite, I think, unusual for a developing country bank to be able to do something along those lines. So Brazil has announced 35% of GDP. I won't quickly add up those numbers, but it's a lot of billions of dollars in liquidity lines. Not money given away, mind you, to banks, but money to provide resources to banks to be able to lend and to renegotiate loans. And also is a way to get funds directly to Brazilian companies to pay their salaries and to pay their suppliers. Again, the risk here in Brazil, as it is in the USA, but especially here in Brazil, is once companies cease to exist, there's no hope of recovery in that company and in many of those sectors. So those central bank actions are very important and they're innovative, and the government has moved more quickly than I thought. One of the most innovative policies, in fact, which is subject to a lot of discussion in Brazil, I don't want to get bogged down on this point, but it would allow the central bank not only to buy bonds issued by the government to finance the government's effort right now in recovery and reconstruction, but also to fund, to underwrite the bonds, the liabilities, that is to say, of private sector companies. Never been done before in Brazil. It requires a constitutional amendment. It's close to approval. I think it could be very important to save at least the 400 largest companies in Brazil, which have more than 100,000 or more than 10,000 workers, excuse me. Those companies will be greatly aided if the central bank can help them out by buying their bonds when there's no private capital market functioning. Finally, on the fiscal side, and before I reach my conclusions, Brazil's total fiscal effort is about announced so far, is about 3 to maybe as much as 5% of GDP on the fiscal side, what the government is doing in addition to what it planned to do. That's small. The US $2 trillion package several weeks ago, that's 10% of US GDP. But 3 to 5% is a reasonably good fiscal effort in the context of Latin America. The biggest debate about that fiscal effort right now in Brazil are emergency packages for states and municipalities who are on the front lines here in Brazil, just as they are in the United States. We also have a federal system, and health is in the hands of states and municipalities here in Brazil. So their revenues have evaporated, their demands for spending have exploded. Their revenues have been, and their balance sheets have been decimated. This is a political battle in Brazil for reasons maybe too complex to get into. It's a standoff between some of the governors who are potential presidential candidates who want the funds, and a president, Bolsonaro, who controls the purse and doesn't want to see his potential political opponents too greatly emerge as heroes in all of this. It's almost like President Trump and Governor Cuomo a little bit, but more so here in Brazil. But Congress, it seems to me, and this is another example I wanted to point out to you, Congress seems to me to be lined up behind the governors. So this package is likely to go through, hopefully within the next couple of days. Just a quick word, what could seem like a detail, but it's not. If Brazil is going to expand its expenditures, its fiscal expenditures very significantly, and there's no one to buy those bonds, the private capital markets are frozen and all that money is leaving Brazil, who buys them? And I think who buys the government's debt and finances the government? And I think the answer is the central bank. Not directly, not directly by giving money to the central government, but by buying bonds of the central government. And I think it can do it so safely, and I think it can do so credibly. It won't create fears all over the world that Brazil has somewhat gone off in a crazy populist direction and faces a highly inflationary future. I think it will be done for as long as it needs to be done, but no longer. But it will be done in the measure that is required. A big advantage that Brazil has is that interest rates here in Brazil are truly at record lows. Just as some of the us old timers here on the line have never seen GDP numbers like we're seeing now. We've also never seen interest rates this low. 3.75% is the basic overnight rate now, versus 40, 50% in years gone by. So that means very simply that the cost of the government issuing debt and servicing the debt is really quite modest. And that debt can eventually be resold into the marketplace once the crisis passes. So that tells you a little bit about three dimensions. There are many, many others and many details about what Brazil has tried to do and how Brazil is responding. And I think the points are the government has been innovative and has moved quicker than one might have expected, as it caught the government's, this particular government, so much by surprise. But that also the government had social institutions pre-established before this government came to power that are actually working well. So that combination of the two, I think, underpins Brazil's response. But let me conclude by, and maybe kick off the discussion, if I go to the final slide, on reassessing the growth outlook in Brazil. Julia, if you could maybe move to that one, not that it's terribly instructive. But I separated this out into a short term, a medium term, and a long term. In the short run, the sudden stop drags on is the way I wrote it. There can be no wavering on the quarantine or self-isolation, no premature rush to reopen the economy. I'm very worried about the dismissal, the pending dismissal of the health minister. Let's see who takes his place. But I think even if President Bolsonaro continues to insist that the economy go back to work, I don't think that there's going to be a great deal of take-up in Sao Paulo and in Rio and other major urban areas most affected by this, because I think popular opinion here in Brazil, much informed by the press, another strong Brazilian social institution, knows the dangers of premature opening. And when in Brazil, we can't afford a second and a third wave. John referred to that too, because our health resources already been exhausted by the first wave. So a second or third wave could be ruinous. The recovery in Brazil will be gradual and U-shaped, not V-shaped. It's going to take months. I think we'll be opening up parts of the economy over the next 3 to 6 months, but not all of the economy. The growth numbers, as I told you, for 2020 will remain low in my view in 2021 and 2022. And yes, full recovery or anything that one could reasonably call full recovery is not till 2022. Those growth numbers are going to be very modest in 2021 and 22. The only numbers I have now are like from the World Bank or from Brazilian forecasters, and they suggest growth of about 2% in 2021 and 2022. Hopefully that's too pessimistic, but I think that's what we'd be prepared for. The stagnation of the Brazilian economy, the semi-recession continues with the risk that we're looking at another lost decade, not just another lost half decade. But there's no reason to think for despair. John also mentioned this in his comments. There are certain sectors of the Brazilian economy that are doing relatively well. Logistics is one. Everybody, the food supply in particular, working quite well. A good nationwide system of roadways and transportation. Telecoms, we're all talking to tonight on the internet it's working well all over the country. Businesses migrated to the extent possible, including our own business at Columbia University here in Brazil, migrated to the internet. That might not have been possible some years ago, but it's working well. Agribusiness is doing quite well and will be a strength of the economy. The financial sector, I don't think can be battered for an indefinite period of time, but it enters this period in a relatively strong state. So I think that's another strength, a pillar, you might say, of an eventual recovery. And then, of course, what will happen after, what other industries survive the crisis and which go under, I won't hazard a guess other than my personal bias, which is to say the smarter industries here in Brazil, of which there are a number, who are already better integrated in the global economy, will be among the survivors. And some of the older dinosaurs from the past, the inefficient manufacturers from the past who've had quite a hold on economic policy for decades here in Brazil, they may not survive, but I've gotten a little bit beyond my brief in that. Well, what about the beyond the horizon scenarios to finish up? The government's agenda must change. The Bolsonaro, Paulo Guedes, the Brazil's finance minister, economy minister, must change practically in its entirety. Their mantra has been fiscal adjustment. They've had some successes. But further fiscal adjustment, I think, is dangerous. A premature rush to get back to reducing the debt to GDP ratio, increasing the primary fiscal surplus, that could be disastrous if the economy slips back into recovery. Microeconomic reforms, another mantra of the Bolsonaro government under Paulo Guedes, will always have some place in any Brazilian economic agenda as they are keys to productivity. But much bigger questions are pushing these questions of microeconomic reforms and more efficiency, making a better environment for business. They're important, don't get me wrong. But the bigger questions are pushing those into the background. And I think the first and the biggest question is the provision of what the economists call public goods to the society: health and education and sanitation and public transportation and so forth. The provision of those public goods is critical to a society's prosperity and survival in times of pandemic. They need and deserve and must receive much greater attention, focus, and investment in the future. And the social inequalities, I'm a little less clear on this point, but the social inequalities which this crisis has laid bare, I suspect are going to work their way back into agenda and not just be seen, addressing social inequalities, not just something the left does in Brazil, but something that it makes sense, not even just moral sense, which it does, but economic sense for the entire country. So I think addressing those inequalities, getting that curve, getting that line of poverty and extreme poverty to continue, once again, to go trend downward, to expand those social programs, it's got to be part of any agenda. I think it'll be part of this government's agenda and through the end of its term in 2022, and any government that takes its place in 2022. And in this respect, the history of the Brazilian economy is very instructive. If you go back decades or a century or more, crises come, Brazil somehow adapts, lessons are learned, and those lessons are put into practice. I would say one lesson is that Brazil's economic and social institutions, apart from government policy, and with a special emphasis on social programs, have been far stronger than anyone might have expected. And they provide a basis for a new and stronger Brazilian economy once adjustment is accomplished and the economy resumes a better and higher rate of growth. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tom. Now, we couldn't have a more comprehensive perspective on what's going on in Brazil from someone who's based in the country and knows thoroughly about the Brazilian economy and Brazilian society. So for the students, I would like to open up for questions if you have. And I'm starting to get some questions in private here that we're going to be saving for the Q&A. Otherwise, let me hand over to Gray Newman, Professor Newman, who is a keen analyst, observer of the global economic situation. And he's going to give us a historical perspective of to what extent this time is different and to what extent the different medicine should be applied. So Gray, all yours.
Sure, thank you very much, Sydney. I was trying to think, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. I was trying to think of ways to disagree with Tom and with John, but I agree with most of what they said. So I apologize in advance for not being able to disagree more. I guess the only thing that I would, rather than going through the global financial crisis, which is what some people are comparing this to, the global financial crisis, if you recall, was a complete different animal. It originated in the financial sector, and because of the impact of stimulus in China on commodity prices and on the Brazilian economy, the impact on Brazilian production and particularly Brazilian consumption, discretionary spending in particular, was extremely limited and very short-lived. And as you've heard before, this has not begun as a financial crisis, and it is started in the real economy from the collapse of production and consumption of particularly discretionary consumption due to the virus. My one concern would be, starting points matter. And the starting point in Brazil, as Tom has highlighted and John has mentioned, the strong reputation of the central bank, However, I am concerned that as both my previous speakers that alluded to or raised, Brazil's had a very difficult and disappointing growth trajectory in the last 5 or 6 years, even longer. And the debt stock in Brazil, compared to where it was 10 years ago, or even 3 or 4 years ago, is at levels that are sort of approaching sort of alarming levels. And so, my only concern here is that what Brazil needs to do in terms of the near-term policy mix, I think Tom has been very eloquent in laying out the near-term policy mix and the benefits from a lot of these strategies. But my concern is how much fiscal space, how much space will markets provide for Brazil actually to be able to implement and execute on this. And there's a lot of work on debt intolerance, and I do begin to be concerned that market participants are could begin to say, can Brazil really tolerate these levels of debt without creating a substantial unraveling? So maybe what I would say is I'm a little more concerned. This is not the fault of the Brazilians, clearly. However, the starting point and the strength of where Brazil's fiscal accounts in particular stand today is the responsibility of policymakers. And I think it leaves Brazil in a more difficult position, perhaps, and significant risk. I also might push back a little bit with the notion of, QE in Brazil. The U.S., and if you even look at the paper that I believe Sydney assigned to the students to read from Barry Eschengreen, arguing that, fiscal and monetary policy can't do a lot, but that doesn't mean that they should not be engaged. And after all, remember, G7, particularly the U.S., is able to borrow at rates significantly below potential GDP growth. My concern is that advice that applies in the G7 sphere has limited applicability in emerging market space and maybe limited applicability in Brazil. So let me just leave with a sort of a cautionary note and turn it back over to you, Sydney.
Thanks very much, Gray. Thanks for the insightful comments. So before we kick off the conversation here, let me ask a question for the three of you. To what extent we can make a parallel between the approach that the Brazilian government has undertaken vis-a-vis the US government's approach, and what are the limitations of both actions? And if you were on the shoes of an advisor to both administrations, what would you suggest? And I see that Gray is looking forward to answer this question. Why don't we start with whoever wants to address this very, very briefly? John?
I can start. If you allow me to share my screen, I made a lot of slides before this, but to Tom's point, these are the initiatives that the central bank put in place, or is putting in place. It looks like they've already put them in place because they're all done by fiat, by the government. Some of it needs some approval, but some of it does not. And you can see at least at the central bank, you have a lot of similar policies to what's going on in the United States, with the exception of buying municipal bonds, because there are none of those anymore. Neither are there state bonds, but they have a huge package that in Congress, as Tom said, to give some relief to the states on their debt and the suspension of debt payments. But you can see that they are now taking in private paper as collateral. So you see the liquidity augmentation policies, loans backed by debentures, loan backed by these long-term deposits that have specific collateral, specific guarantees, doing repos in Brazilian sovereign bonds. That's never happened before, and that's in dollars. Loans backed by banknotes, relaxed regulation on agricultural notes. So you're seeing the central bank giving at least liquidity to things that it never used to do. And now they've also reduced, and the main thing that they did, and this where I think I'm on a different, I'm much more orthodox than Tom, I'll have to say. Sorry about that, Tom, but I'm not quite so negative on what they're doing. But what we're seeing, the real question is, will Brazil go back to this market segmentation and financial repression that we saw starting in about 2009 and lasting until things were undone starting in 2016. And it used to be the sort of order of the day, having a segmented market. But we're starting to see a relaxation of these massively high reserve requirements. There is no country in the world that has reserve requirements anywhere near where Brazil has. And this is a legacy of the inflationary times. You basically have inflation and to be able to capture enough inflation tax to finance the fiscal side, you had to keep high reserve requirements. And there's really absolutely no need for Brazil to have this. For example, I'm going to give you two more graphs here. Just bear with me. First, this is a graph of nominal credit against inflation. And you can see there's a negative relationship. So it's actually the inflation side that causes what happens with the absolute level of credit, not the other way around. The low inflation rates have allowed Brazil to expand its credit, and we've seen most of the financial repression go away that we had recently. Here's another thing. Higher reserve requirements are associated with higher inflation. Again, this is the causality runs the other way from many of the arguments, is that when the government was going into tight fiscal problems, people would reduce their money balances, and the only way to capture that inflation tax was to commit more financial repression by raising reserve requirements. And just to give one last thing, you can see that there was a big expansion of subsidized credit that was starting to be unwound, and it was being unwound mostly through market means. How was that? You can see that this financial deepening stopped and was starting to recover before this crisis. Certainly we're going to have some problems with that in the next year. But you can look at the two policy rates. First, the Selic rate, which is controlled by the central bank, and the TJLP, which was and now it's the TLP that is now market-based. When you had these very highly subsidized rates on subsidized credit, the only way to tighten monetary policy was to shove the Selic rate twice as high as it otherwise would. So I don't see this government, nor future governments for that matter, going back on what was really Meirelles' dream, and then he was subverted. This sort of these distortions, I think, are not going to come back with this rather large expansion of public sector credit, even though it's going to happen through the public banks. I think it'd be similar to, and please, the others please comment on this, the first QE things that the Fed did, the supplement for money market funds, to intervene in markets that were broken. MBS was broken too, but then it got fixed rather quickly. And you saw all of these markets, once their funding came back, all these assets went off the Fed balance sheet. I think these policies are reversal to good end, and the temporary nature of this will I think anchor expectations, certainly on inflation. And finally, that's also true of Social Security reform. We finally have not a solvent Social Security system, but something that's not wildly insolvent and getting even more insolvent, at least has a minimum retirement age. And I think that gives individuals and investors something to cling on to. So I was looking at the curves. You have a steeper curve, but we're still talking about a long end of the curve, very long end of the Brazilian curve at 7% in reais. And that's fairly encouraging. I'll stop there.
Yep. Tom?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Sydney. I think we kind of switched roles. John talked an issue about containment policy. Let me go back to containment policy, because you've asked to contrast the US and Brazil. And I would say that the situation in Brazil, for those in the United States listening to us tonight, is very similar. You have a president who's skeptical, or took a while to be convinced of the need for containment, and governors who've taken the lead. So the reaction is very similar. You've had a big pickup by the local population in adherence. The health minister, the late great health minister, has 75% approval rating. That's one of the reasons he's non-political, kind of in political hot water. at the present. But I would take advantage of your question to say, so the reaction has been similar, the containment has been similar, the strength of state and local governments has been similar. The disparity, I think, Sydney, is sort of a global inequity that countries like Brazil, and Brazil is far from the worst case, we're a middle income country, but Brazil is always going to get outbid for face masks, for PPEs, for ventilators. There are stories in the newspapers, anecdotes in the newspapers of Brazilian shipments being hijacked and sent to Europe or diverted to the United States. We have no capacity here, Sydney, to do testing on a large scale. It almost doesn't exist. It isn't really part of the conversation yet. Maybe in a couple of months, we'll be able to do that. Brazilian labs will gear up. Manufacturers will provide that domestically. But we're flying blind here in Brazil and will be for weeks or months to come. The US is a little bit ahead of us there, and I don't see any way to catch up with that. And then the final thing I would say is, although President Trump does a lot to isolate the US diplomatically, Brazil is really isolated diplomatically right now. It doesn't get along that well with its neighbors. There's no real sort of a sense that if Brazil needed significant international help, which hopefully it won't, but it might, there's not like a network of allies and friends who can share equipment with Brazil, who will take an interest in Brazil, will help finance Brazil if need be. So I think all of those are some differences in Brazil. I just don't know what Brazil can do, Sydney, to make up for those differences in the approach between the two countries.
Thanks, Tom. And Gray, your two cents.
Sure. The only thing I would add is I think the Brazil, as a recommendation to a policymaker, would be to continue to focus on the things that you need to focus on, trying to provide liquidity in markets that threaten to break down, trying to provide income support to reduce the level of potential unemployment increases, try to provide protection for enterprises that are having a liquidity crisis convert into a solvency issue, but always keep, one eye behind you, remembering that Brazil is not a reserve currency economy, and that the lessons and the ability of the US and some of the G7 countries, what they're able to accomplish, Brazil may find itself in a much different position. And so just to be aware that while the US often in a crisis period enjoys a flight to quality, and that benefits the US, what we saw from the chart earlier from the outflows in emerging markets in Brazil are something that are likely to limit the policy space.
Yep, perfect. Thanks so much, Gray. Before we start the Q&A part, let's try something different here. And I prepared this polling, so a sentiment analysis. So everyone, please, you should have received 3 questions. Can you see them on your screen? Yes, so let's take a couple of, 1 minute to go through them.
I don't see them.
Does anybody also have any problems with the poll? It should be on the screen. Yeah, and Tom, if you go to on the bottom of your main screen, there's polls or polling.
It's like some of the simulations I've seen on the spread of the virus over the last 2 weeks. Right before my eyes, it's evolving.
Where do you see the polling, Sydney? Because I voted, it was covering your face, but I don't see the polling.
It should be, this is a new tool for me too. I'm assuming that once I uploaded the poll,
okay,
it should be on your screen.
If you move your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, it appears polling.
Yep.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I couldn't vote. I didn't get to vote. It went straight to the screen where it was tallying the.
I think it is because you are a co-host.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
You don't count, John.
Yeah, the tiebreaker. No, thanks, Julia. All right, there are 15 more seconds.
Is voting mandatory?
Well, in Brazil, it is, not in the US. All right, so ending the poll here. And I'm going to relaunch it just in case if somebody needs to do it again. Okay, so
Can we vote twice?
that would be auditing.
Oh.
All right, so let's start with Q&A. And Julia has a question. Julia.
And thank you. And actually, I wanted, I feel like I'm skipping the line here, but okay. Thank you, Sydney. I just wanted to know, there's a lot of economists talking about, so we have to do some really expensive fiscal policies right now, social and economical. How likely do you think it is that we'll be able to pass in Congress a tax reform that will include taxing the share of dividends or taxing big fortunes so we can increase tax revenue for the state?
Good question.
I can give you the Treasury Secretary's answer to that question that we had earlier today, and maybe just give he basically said right now they're focusing only on this virus, and any fiscal things that they're taking are to alleviate and try to keep, especially in jobs in the small and medium-sized corporations. So you've seen some tax relief. The other question is, okay, what happens when it's over? Clearly, as Tom said, you're going to have this big fiscal deficit surge and big debt surge. What happens later? The response he gave was that they're going to go, right now, all privatization is on hold, right? And any tax reform is on hold as well. But they'll need even more so to come back and have the revenues. He thinks the tax reform part, not necessarily including an increase in taxes, maybe whatever they do, as an increase, they'll try to do temporarily. But he sees they're going to definitely need the revenues from privatization and the efficiency gains later once things sort of settle down. But certainly now is not the time to be selling assets. You don't sell at the bottom. But that was the answer he gave, and it seemed like a good answer to me.
Good. Yes, Tom?
Yeah, I think Julia's question is a good one, and I agree with what John has just said, but I do think that Brazil is going to have to take a long, hard look at tax reform. Broadly speaking, the tax system is very regressive here in Brazil, and that the poor pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than the very wealthy do. Dividends are not taxed. There's no Piketty tax here where you're taxing net worth in any significant respect. I do think, John and Gray, that taxes are going to have to, I'm not certain how much of a revenue gain this will be and what evasion will be like, but Brazil is pretty good at tracking people and has a pretty good internal revenue system. I think there's going to be a tax reform that will do three things that will make the tax system less complicated and a little bit more business friendly, so to speak, which is it's very complex now. Second, it would shift the burden more to the upper income groups, maybe hopefully get to the top 1%. I don't know if they can or not, but I think they should, reducing the weight of indirect taxes in that respect. Well, I'll just leave it at there, but I do think that taxes, unfortunately, are going to have to rise in terms of percentage of GDP. That's how you pay. That's how governments pay back their debt after a war. And this has been, as the government is very clear in saying, this is a war. Yeah. So the debt of the war has to be repaid, and that means higher taxes wherever you can grab the money. But it should be done, as John is suggesting, in a way that helps the recovery and not hindering it.
Pretty good.
I just wanted to add something because I agree with both sets of comments by Tom. First on the social distancing and the reaction of the governors and what he just went through. Certainly Brazil's tax system is hugely full of distortions, regressive, and incredibly complicated. But Brazil, its federalism has maybe not worked quite as well as the US and the free press as well in sort of containing policy to focusing on doing their best. But it is problematic, and the states went into this in horrible shape fiscally. And really, to do a full tax reform in Brazil, you would have to define the tax base of all the levels of governments. And maybe this is the way to do it. We took something like this to do it. I hope so, because as you absolutely correctly point out, that the tax system is unwieldy. It's trying to get to these things where that you have much more neutral type taxes and less cascading or triple, quadruple, quintuple taxation of different parts of the product, and make it less regressive is very difficult. But maybe this is the sort of explosion that is needed to get it done.
Good, thank you. So we have a few questions here on the chat, and let's start with Marcio Tasman da Silva. And his question actually something that Tom made reference to, and he wants to know a little bit about the SUS and to what extent it can help Brazil overcome this crisis, and in which ways the robustness of the system is really a good example, as you mentioned, Tom.
That's an excellent question by Marcion. It goes back to the previous question about the difference between the U.S. We do have a national health system here in Brazil, and I would say thank God we do. The SUS system is much maligned here in Brazil. I mean, if you've got upper middle income, upper income, people would never use the public hospitals. They go to private clinics which don't accept insurance, and private doctors. But the SUS is available, Sydney, it seems, for everybody else. There are hospitals here in Rio, where I live, and certainly in Sao Paulo, which are what they call reference hospitals for the treatment of COVID patients. And I think they can pretty much provide the basic care, maybe not handle the most complex operations, and not in scale handle complex operations. But if you or any one of us was with COVID and needed hospitalization, you'd be in good hands, and there are still beds available. So I think number one is sort of like the final, the SUS system, the public hospital system is actually a good one. But what I emphasized, and why I think it's so important, is the role of health workers here in Brazil. As I mentioned to you, Brazil doesn't just wait for people to come in and say they've got a health problem. Many people don't know how to use the bureaucracy, or don't approach doctors, don't have money for doctors, are not acquainted with the facilities available. Health workers here in Brazil, we've done many studies of this at Columbia over the years. Health are very important in going door to door, in knowing what's going on in your neighborhood, in your favela, what is actually going on. So I mean, it's hopefully right now, that's exactly what's happening in favelas like Rocinha, Cidade de Deus, Maré, Paraisópolis, in São Paulo. You're seeing, and hope this is true, that the rate of infection in our poorest urban communities, where people don't have good health conditions, don't have access to running water at all times, don't have sanitation, yet the rate of infection so far is kind of small. And I'm completely beyond my database here, my depth in data, but I do believe that's a testimonial, as I was telling you earlier, about the effectiveness of the public health system. It's really the backbone of healthcare here in Brazil. And I think, as Marcia's question gives me an opportunity to say once again, it's a social institution that works well, despite the fact that it's held in kind of contempt by the elite. It's probably going to save us in this crisis. At the end of the day, could be that the SUS works so well.
Yeah, no, pretty good. Thanks, Tom. And there's a question from Andressa Azevedo, and I guess maybe Gray, since Gray addressed the historical issues and the previous crisis, because her question is about bankruptcy of the country. And when you think about the 80s, like when Latin American country declared a moratorium, and even like more recently, right, Argentina has been sort of faced some similar situation. So do we see this kind of risk under the present circumstances?
Well, listen, I haven't seen what credit default swaps have been doing in Brazil in the last week or so. Maybe someone else could pop it up on the screen, but I clearly think the risk is there, and my concern is the risk is rising. And my concern, the risk is rising because of the combination of a significant deterioration in the primary fiscal balance from what was already an alarming deficit to a much larger deficit, and the growth in the debt stock. So, I mean, the good news, as we know, is most of the debt in Brazil is held by Brazilians. A lot of it is locally issued. Brazil has tremendous levels of reserves relative to external debt. So, you know, there are all those considerations. But I do think the risk, not a, you know, certainly not a base case scenario, but I think the risk is that growth is damaged longer, because think about bankruptcy at a corporate level. It damages the growth prospect, and a lot of these measures that, you know, John has emphasized as being temporary in nature, for political reasons with a deterioration growth prospects, the temporary ends up lasting a lot longer than you expect. And I think in that case, you know, I think the risks have risen today in Brazil.
Good. John, Tom, does anybody disagree?
I was just going to mention that, yes, the temporary tends to last way longer than temporary, unfortunately. Columbia University knows this quite well, although all of you are probably too young. But when I was an undergrad there, they were still playing in the temporary wood stadium at Baker Field that was erected in 1926 when Sid Luckman played for the Columbia Lions. Last time they actually did something really good, I guess. Or recently they're pretty good, but yeah, it's, you know, I think they finally redid the stadiums in the late 80s, early 90s. I don't remember, but 1926 to 1990 was about how long that was there.
Good. Thanks, John. And a question from Gabriel Purisoli, and he's addressing politics, right? So even though we're talking about the economic impact of COVID-19, but we cannot dissociate that from the political landscape. So as observers of the situation in Brazil, and Tom, you mentioned that current Minister of Health has been or is going to be ousted very soon. Can we assess to what extent the current administration has the ability to deal with this crisis, and if not, like, what are the possible alternatives?
Well, I think, I don't know, here, this is kind of a political question. What kind of game is President Bolsonaro playing? Because he himself may have he went with a large group to Florida recently, and 22 members of his team got sick, some of them presumably seriously. So he cannot be unaware of the risks, even in his own personal life. So what kind of game is he playing in politically? And I think it's a game that says, I'm going to be known as the guy who wanted to reopen the economy as quickly as possible. And I want the governors and Congress and my political opposition to be known as the one who put through unnecessary hardships that lasted too long. But I don't actually see, so I think that's the game that's being played. President Trump plays this game, as you know, in the United States. They talk a big game, but they don't actually change policies on the ground. And the containment policies have a broad public popular acceptance. And President Bolsonaro's popularity is down to about 30% and probably heading south. So what's behind that thinking on his part? He can't be unaware of the risks, and he knows public opinion is against him. He's looking to a day when people are going to thank him for finally talking sense into these scientists and medical people who wanted to put us through unnecessary suffering on the basis of unproven worst case scenarios. In the short run, talking about the dismissal of Health Minister Luis Henrique Mandetta, which hasn't occurred yet. I predicted it before, and he's managed to survive. I think that whoever takes his place, I've seen a list of the preliminary names, is going to probably continue the same policies, Sydney, maybe a little bit more adroitly politically, not to upset directly President Bolsonaro, to kind of humor President Bolsonaro, but not substantially change, if that's the nature of this question, change Brazil's approach to containment. Because as I've emphasized in my remarks, we don't have any other strategy. We can't test. We don't have hospital facilities. We couldn't possibly handle a second wave. So I think it's a part of a complex political game. It's the only way I understand President Bolsonaro's attitude. And I understand that by looking at what President Trump is doing, because I think he's doing pretty much the same thing. I don't know if that was clear or not, but I don't look for any disastrous changes in the short run or significant changes in the next couple of weeks or months in terms of isolation and containment.
Good. No, thanks, Tom. And a question from Kasia, and I think for all of us here, right, it would be interesting to share some personal perspectives more than the political or our political views. But does it make sense to think about reopening the economy immediately? Right. So there are some controversial views about vertical interventions, but I think there's what there's no question about is that the need for the country to back to normal as fast as possible. And we're starting to see even here in the US on the state level and the discussion about trying to get things to work as usual. Governor Cuomo recently announced that the worst is behind us, probably. And so I think this is an indication that we might be starting to see there's some lifting on the quarantine requirements. So for the panelists here, could you please share with us your personal perspectives on how you see this happening?
If I just start with just two quick comments. I think the quickest way to reactivate the economy is containment and social distancing. I think everything else is a dangerous and misleading fairy tale because of the follow-on consequences of it. And second, I think one advantage we have in Brazil, and then also in the United States, but mainly here in Brazil learns lessons very quickly, and it's seeing what already countries like Austria and Denmark and now Italy, Germany, Spain, they're starting to open the economy, and they're showing the way, Sydney, that Brazil will start to reopen its economy, starting in areas of the country which are less affected, where there are adequate testing is in place, where there are sectors that are really truly are essential. I think no one could possibly be against it. No one is a masochist, no one is a sadist in all of this. It wants the economy to suffer longer than they have to. But that's simply, I don't think that's any bold forecast. That's simply what's going to have to happen. It's going to open up gradually over time as it's safe to do so. No sooner, but also no later than it's safe to do so.
I'll just add, I agree with everything Tom said in his last two answers. And just to echo what he's saying, you know, in the United States, you could possibly entertain, if we had done it earlier, especially with testing, vertical sheltering. But in a country like Brazil, especially with the distribution of income, it's very difficult to say, how are you going to separate the elderly from young people that live in one room? It's impossible to do it. So I think you're absolutely right, Tom. There's really no other way. You gotta keep things from overwhelming the medical infrastructure, and the only way to do that is social distancing.
Yes, Sydney, the other thing I would add here is that the economic impact, which is what is driving the idea of reopening, is going to be a function not only of the virus, and that raises the issues that Tom and John have raised. But the economic impact is also going to be driven by, you know, consumer confidence, willingness to spend, willingness to travel, willingness to eat in restaurants again, and it also is going to be dependent upon sort of spillovers from other global economies. So whatever any one country does, you know, depending on what happens to activity in China, for example, and what's happening to oil prices, et cetera, it's not as simple as saying, you know, it's not really in the hands, I think, of policymakers today to sort of reactivate the economy by waving a wand and saying we're going to eliminate containment in a particular region.
Yeah, no. Thanks, everyone. So great, actually, let me put you in a spotlight again. And as a guest commentator, I'd like to ask you a favor. Could you ask a question to our panelists and something that we haven't talked about before and that you think that they disagree with you?
Well, I think they disagree, and I would be interested in getting the perspective from John and Tom. You know, my concern is can a country like Brazil actually put in place quantitative easing of the kind that's being discussed? The central bank, has operational or has had operational autonomy. It has a strong reputation in markets, has a strong reputation among price setters in Brazil. Has been very successful in tackling inflation. But isn't that sort of playing with fire or taking something that may work in the G7 textbook, but it's awfully dangerous in an emerging market space?
Yeah, and for our non-technical audience, or people without an economics background, if you could explain the basis for a quantitative easing approach.
Well, I'll ask the two. I'll ask my Tom and John to give me their. I learned years ago in another country, asking a central banker how to define something, and afterwards, every member of the board met. They all gave me different answers, and then they had a board meeting to discuss why none of them could agree on what it was they were even talking about. So I'm going to leave that to Tom and John rather than opening up another can of worms.
Unfortunately, I think you hit the guy. You want to start, Mark?
No, I want our ex-central banker to start.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, Brazil is one of the greatest quantitative easing countries in the world. They have, decades. Go back to ensinamento back in the 19th century. They're really good at printing money, which is basically quantitative easing. Is if you get to a point where you can't use interest rates, you buy assets by creating reserve monetary base. And Brazil has done that. Now, yes, it's dangerous. Is Brazil in a situation where it's dangerous right now? I think that's an open question, because we've seen Brazilian financial markets and all markets, but mainly the Brazilian local ones, reacting in what I would call a normal way, which they never did when the central bank was easing. Typically, you would see inflation expectations surge. The central bank you'd lose control of the exchange rate, and inflation would accelerate rather quickly. What holds things in? And I think it really is the prospect that you get back to fiscal reasonableness, not necessarily greatness, and having the structural reform, among others, but the most important one was Social Security. Brazil's Social Security system was, except maybe Greece, had the most bankrupt system that I've ever seen. And you just don't, right now it's still running a primary deficit of 4.25% of GDP if you add the RPPS, the RGPS. But the prospect of not having to have those deficits accelerate, and certainly the RGPS one was accelerating with the aging, is one, it's a really important thing in terms of expectations at the fiscal side. At some point or another down the road, they will get it back in line. It's going to be a tough course. But I think partially the reason we're seeing decent reaction of expectations that right now the market is discounting a Selic rate almost under 1% at this point. You would never have seen that. You would have seen any worries that the fiscal side was expanding. You'd see, market interest rates spiking. You wouldn't see, even though it's a steep curve, you wouldn't see it so flat. So it is definitely a dangerous thing. I think the policymakers, certainly Mansueto he didn't want to talk too much about monetary policy. They are very cognizant of that. And they want to make sure that the perception is this is aid for a pandemic. These aren't supposed to be meant for permanence. And then the fight is afterward to keep them from staying permanent once it goes. But I'm a little more optimistic than Tom on the real economy. Though I actually ventured forecasted fiddling with forecasts today, and they surprisingly corresponded to 2 months sweat those, especially on the fiscal side. We're going to get a primary deficit of about 8% of GDP by the end of the year. That's what it looks like, right. Especially with the 680 billion reais that they're either approved or pushing through. But it's the fact that I think the underlying trends in the economy, despite the slow recovery, were pretty strong. And I say that for the following reason. You can explain a good portion of the poor recovery from 3 major shocks and 1 temporary one. The first was the trucker strike in 2018, which caused a very big negative carryover. And Brazil is hobgoblin they are at ransom. These guys can take them because they never invested enough in railroad transportation. So they are hostage to the truck drivers. Second was the second tailings pond disaster in Brumadinho, where they had to basically shut down all iron ore and steel production, especially in Minas Gerais. They just shut down all the mines, and that massively hit intermediate goods. If you look at the other parts, the components of GDP, they were pretty good. Consumption was growing 2%, services were growing 2 to 3%. So then the third one was Argentina, the collapse of Argentina. So you saw, even though you saw a very strong recovery in demand before all the COVID, of double digits for almost 2 years straight in durables demand, especially automobiles, exports to Argentina fell by 50%. And then we add the fact that people were waiting for the Social Security reform to pass, and that kind of stopped investment for a while. So I don't think the economy, it was disappointing for sure. But I don't think it's the underlying sentiment was as bad as that. I think there is a recovery story here once this passes, but it's a tough one and it's not a short road. So I talked too long. Sorry about that.
I just like to say, I know Professor Newman is going to give me a good grade on this answer, but quantitative easing in my mind is how the central bank, in this case, the Central Bank of Brazil, can lower borrowing costs for companies other than by reducing interest rates. Because interest rates, as John just said, are pretty much near rock bottom. It's 3.75%. John says the market is discounting 1%. But that's not such good news because the private sector can't borrow at any rates. The market, remember the chart on capital outflows. So what the central bank does, instead of lowering the interest rate from 3 to 1, it'll do that, and that may help, but it will massively go into the marketplace and purchase bonds from private sector companies who are otherwise good companies, but can't get anybody anywhere in the world to buy their bonds and to roll over their debt. If they can't buy their bonds and roll over their debt, those companies go bankrupt. So quantitative easing in this case is taking the liabilities of companies, private companies, and onto the balance sheet of the Central Bank of Brazil. I don't know how Gray is going to like it. That's sort of the guts of quantitative easing. And I think you just got to do it. Now, Gray is right that this is filled with pitfalls. I mean, whose companies are getting their debt bought and whose aren't, and political favoritism, and aren't we letting the private sector get away with murder when people are starving? And all that conversation will occur and is occurring. But I think the basic concept is a good one. It hasn't been approved, all that preamble notwithstanding, it hasn't been approved yet and may not be approved, but I think it's likely to happen. It may not be decisive, Gray, but I think, so I think you're right to be skeptical about it. The other aspect of quantitative easing is what John said, that the central bank has done this forever, which is to basically fund the government by buying the government's bonds. When this happens, the central bank is basically printing money and financing government operations. But as John is also suggesting, and Gray, I think, referred to this as well, this is a different Brazil from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s of high inflation, no credibility in monetary management or fiscal management. I think there's a lot of credibility in Brazil right now. Brazil can afford, I think, a period of time where most of the financing comes from the central bank by buying bonds, very low interest rates. If the basic interest rate is only 3%, that means people don't think there's a big risk right now. This could change, as Gray warns us. This could change, but right now they don't think there's a big risk that Brazil is not going to pay you back. So take advantage of that. Buy those bonds now. The government doesn't have a lot of debt servicing responsibilities, and so that for me is quantitative easing. There's another related point which people have asked about, and that is about Brazil's international reserve. I don't know if John or mentioned or Gray. I think there's like $350 billion in international reserves in Brazil. It's a slippery slope. You don't want to start selling those reserves, but you could. You could sell some of them, and with the proceeds, the central bank could transfer the proceeds back to the federal government. But I don't think they're going to do that. I think that'd be the last thing they're going to do, because it could create panic about the government's true financial.
Great question, Ray. And Tom, your answer was great. You also tripped another sort of memory wire. In the 2008 crisis, the central bank, you had a lot of companies not able to roll over their debt externally. But the central bank wasn't allowed to directly lend to those companies. They can buy paper now, but they couldn't directly lend. So they set up a system where they auction credit lines in dollars off to use their reserves, off to the banking system. And most of this intermediation is done through the banks. It's not the central bank picking winners and losers. And that they auction those lines as well. They've been auctioning them throughout. And when they don't like what's going on in the foreign exchange market, or they're getting news that this particular company can't roll their external lines, they're quite quickly with an auction of lines. And that's also and it's as market-based as you can get. As Tom said, they really tried to, instead of it being heavy-handed intervention, they really tried to work through the market on this. And that's why it's been quite efficient.
All right, so we have 5 minutes, and let's switch gears here. And at the end of every class, we always devote some time to talk about professional development. So let's finish on a positive note, in the midst of this crisis. And when I say positive, it is because the three of you have very distinguished careers, right? You have developed all this expertise and have been recognized as brilliant analysts in Wall Street. You spent, or the three of you have this strong connection with academia. At least the two of you have also worked on the nonprofit sector. And so I would like to ask each one of you to share one piece of advice for our students who are starting to embark on their professional life. So why don't we start with Gray Newman here?
You there, Gray?
Mute myself. There you go. I have a hard time. Listen, I think I've probably said this before, find your own voice, find what you believe in, think about who you are, spend a lot of time self-examining. Am I a numbers person? Am I a big pictures person? Am I the accountant? Am I the macro? Am I the service provider? Figure out what you're good at, figure out what you enjoy doing, and make sure that you use your career and use your opportunities wherever you're working to strengthen those areas, and try to balance yourself out. But at the end of the day, I think the best analysts are people that I would say the best professionals are people that spend time trying to really be introspective and understand who they are, and do what you enjoy doing. In my case, I enjoy questioning. That's why I enjoy asking John and Sydney and Tom questions. But as an analyst, I doubt everything. So as an analyst, I would wake up every morning calling into question all of my thoughts and all of my public views, and sitting down with my team and arguing about where we could be wrong. But that's not everyone's strength. So, find your strength, find your voice, and I think you'll be most successful if you do that.
That's great, appreciate it. Yeah, so John.
I don't know if I could say anything better than that, Gray. I would have to say follow your passion. I do what I do because it worked out that way. I love Brazil. Economics is my second favorite thing in the world behind football, soccer. And I'm a much better economist. You can see what kind of a player I used to be. And then as you do that, you tend to gravitate towards people that have the same passion. So I've been blessed to work with very generous people, and that includes both Gray and Tom. I met Gray when he was in Mexico at the embassy there years ago. I won't say how long, and I've known Tom even longer. I met him when he came to give a lecture at the University of Illinois. And I've just been blessed to work with just incredible people, especially with Brazil. So, you know, my objective was Brazil, economics, and Werner Bears found me and he said, you're not going anywhere else. You're going to do it here at Illinois. And there's just so many people that I've met over my career that are just really are my educators. And I don't think I'm as old as I am. I still am 17 in my head and still consider myself a student, and always be a student and keep learning. And that's the only, I don't have anything else, because I basically, when I choose, I don't choose well. Whenever it takes me to where I'm going, it works much better.
Good. Thanks, John. And last but not least, Tom.
It's hard to follow up because, yeah, I've been a mentor at least to John, and his career turned out pretty well. So I don't know if it's because John ignored my advice or followed it, and probably a mixture of both. I agree. I mean, the three of us are giving you an answer that's a little skewed toward having a skill, having confidence in your ability to make a contribution. Three of us are all in the field of economics, but there are other fields as well. You do need to work on I think it's not news to your students that you do have to come out of school with a sense that this is a field that I know I'm passionate about and that I know something about and that I have a credential in. So assuming mostly your students are already doing that, but that stays with you your whole life. And as John said too, and I agree with him, it's perpetual learning. None of us knew about sudden stops caused by pandemics until weeks ago, but you know, you've got to always be open to learning, looking for opportunities to improve upon those skills and develop new ones. And that's kind of a platitude, I guess, in general. But what I'd like to finish with is, I think all three of us, or let me speak only for myself, but I think you have sort of a sense of public service. At least many students at Columbia do, those at CEPA primarily, but also throughout the university. We're going through a crisis of leadership, and this is what this crisis, Sydney, globally has shown us: and nationalism and populism and God knows what else, racism, and rearing their ugly heads again. There is a tremendous crisis of leadership happening in the world. So I would encourage any of those students to take inspiration in who I think are the heroes of today. They're not the investment bankers or the hedge fund owners of our time. They're healthcare workers at Columbia University Medical Center. They're teaching in New York City public school system or throughout or back in their home countries. They're going, particularly as John and Gray's careers show better than mine, they go into and out of public service. They believe in public service. They believe they can make a contribution. So I don't think I'm saying anything that would take people as particularly new, but I think find your passion, get your skill, commit yourself to a lifetime of learning, and think about being in positions of leadership. If the opportunities are there for you, try it in the public sector. Try it in an area where you can give back to people. I think, forget about how much money you're going to make or the prestige of the particular line of work that you choose. I think that's what's important for this next generation: leadership, public sector, giving back, education, healthcare. Look for ways to contribute there, because that's where the future of the world, climate change I could have mentioned too, but that's where the future of the world, of your world, rests.
Very well said, Tom. And we couldn't have finished in such a higher note. No, thanks so much for reminding us why we're doing this and why we're here. Right? It is to prepare people and share knowledge and inspire them, hopefully, to make a difference in the world. Talking about making a difference in the world, we have one more session in 2 weeks, and we're going to be talking about volatility and risk with the Chief Risk Officer of B3, Andrea Montero. And I think it's going to be a good complement to today's session. Right? So John, Gray, Tom, and Julia, and Virtual Talk, and all the students and participants, thanks so much for joining us. And I think we can say that this was a very successful session, not only because of the quality of the discussion, but also because we didn't get bombed by any attacks in Zoom. So I feel relieved, to to say the least. So thanks so much, and again, congratulations. So we'll be back in a couple of weeks. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Sydney. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Everybody stay healthy, stay safe.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Good to see you all.
Right.
Hi, great. Good night.
Thank you.